The town of Hollow Creek was quiet, too quiet. The harvest moon, fat and orange, hung low in the sky. It cast long, eerie shadows across the fields. The corn stalks, tall and dry, swayed like phantoms in the night breeze. And the scarecrows, silent sentinels stuffed with straw and menace. Their hollow eyes seemed to watch, always watching, waiting. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and dying leaves. Autumn had come to Hollow Creek, and with it the promise of something sinister. Old Man Hemlock sat on his porch, rocking slowly. The creak of the wooden chair was the only sound in the stillness of the evening. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant call of an owl. Hemlock's eyes, though clouded with age, still held a sharpness that belied his years. He'd seen many things in his long life, but the tales of the Scarecrow demon always sent a shiver down his spine. He'd seen more harvest moons than he could count. Each one brought with it a sense of foreboding, a reminder of the stories his own grandfather had told him. Stories of a demon that walked the earth under the harvest moon, seeking out the innocent to claim their souls, more than he cared to remember. Each year, as the nights grew longer and the shadows deeper, the whispers would start. Whispers of children gone missing, of strange figures seen in the fields at dusk. Hemlock had always dismissed them as mere tales, but deep down he knew there was truth to them. He sucked on his pipe, the embers glowing like malevolent eyes in the darkness. The smoke curled around him, a protective shroud against the encroaching night. He muttered to himself, the words barely audible, "The Scarecrow demon takes him." His voice was a dry rasp, filled with the weight of years and the burden of knowledge. "The Scarecrow demon takes him," he muttered, his voice a dry rasp. The children of Hollow Creek knew the stories. They'd heard them from their parents, who had heard them from theirs. Each generation adding their own details, their own fears. The stories were a part of the town's fabric, woven into the very essence of their lives. The children of Hollow Creek knew the stories. They gathered around campfires, their faces lit by the flickering flames, listening with wide eyes and bated breath. The tales were always the same, yet each telling brought a fresh wave of fear. Whispered warnings passed down through generations. Whispered warnings passed down through generations. The Scarecrow demon, they said, was a creature of the night, a being of pure malevolence. It walked the earth under the harvest moon, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It sought out the innocent, those whose souls were untainted by the world's darkness, a demon that walked the earth under the harvest moon. It moved silently through the fields, its presence heralded by the rustling of the corn and the whisper of the wind. The Scarecrow, once a benign guardian of the crops, became a symbol of dread, its tattered clothes and hollow eyes a reminder of the demon's power. A demon that stole the souls of the innocent and took their forms. The stories told of children who vanished, only to return as hollow shells of their former selves. Their eyes, once bright with life, now dull and empty. The demon, it was said, could mimic their voices, their mannerisms, but it could never replicate their souls. This year the whispers were louder, more insistent, more afraid. The harvest moon was approaching, and with it the fear that the Scarecrow demon would return. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the fields, to the shadows that seemed to grow longer with each passing day. Old Man Hemlock knew that this year would be different. This year the demon would come for him. The first Scarecrow vanished on the eve of the harvest moon. It was gone, leaving behind only an empty suit of clothes and the faintest whiff of decay. Then another, and another. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the whispers. The townsfolk, hardened by generations of farming and hardship, looked at their children with suspicion. They locked their doors at night. But it wasn't the living they feared. It was the dead. The night the Scarecrows returned, the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to unfold. The fields, usually so full of life, seemed to wither under the oppressive darkness. The moon hung blood-red in the sky. It cast an eerie glow over the landscape, bathing everything in a sinister crimson light. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a harbinger of the horrors to come. A storm raged, wind howling like a banshee, rain lashing the earth. The storm seemed almost alive, a malevolent force intent on wreaking havoc. And then silence, an unnatural, suffocating silence that pressed down on the town like a heavy shroud. The townsfolk held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew something was coming, something terrible. They could feel it in their bones, a primal fear that gripped them and refused to let go. Listening for the screams they knew were coming. The air was thick with tension, every creak and rustle amplified in the oppressive silence. They waited, dreading the moment when the night would be shattered by the sound of terror. They found the first one at dawn. Not a scarecrow anymore. No, something else, something twisted, something evil. Its form was grotesque, a perversion of the familiar figure that once stood guard over the fields. Now it was a harbinger of doom. It stood in the town square, a silent sentinel of horror. The townsfolk gathered around it, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. How could something so familiar become so terrifying? Its burlap face contorted in a grotesque mockery of a smile. In its outstretched hand, it held a symbol of innocence, corrupted. The sight was enough to send shivers down the spine of even the bravest soul. It clutched a child's doll. The doll's once bright eyes were now dull and lifeless, a reflection of the horror that had befallen the town. It was a chilling reminder of the innocence lost in the face of such malevolence. Its once empty eye sockets burned with a cold, malevolent fire. The flames seemed to flicker with a life of their own, a sinister intelligence that watched and waited. The townsfolk could only stare in horror, knowing that this was just the beginning. The killings were swift, brutal. The once peaceful cornfields, bathed in the golden hues of sunset, had turned into a nightmarish landscape. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of the cornstalks, as if whispering secrets of the horrors they had witnessed. The scarecrows, no longer protectors of the fields, became instruments of death. Their once benign presence, meant to ward off pests, had transformed into something malevolent. The glow in their eyes was not just a trick of the light, but a sinister gleam that hinted at the dark forces animating them. Their straw-stuffed limbs, animated by something dark and ancient, moved with terrifying speed and precision. Each movement was deliberate, each strike calculated. It was as if they were driven by an insatiable hunger for blood, a thirst that could never be quenched. The fields, once a symbol of life and growth, had become a hunting ground for these twisted creations. They found little Timmy Henderson in the cornfield, his body impaled on a broken fence post. The sight was gruesome, a stark reminder of the innocence lost. Timmy, who once played joyfully among the cornstalks, had become a victim of the very scarecrows he once found amusing. The scarecrows had used his blood to paint the cornstalks a horrifying shade of crimson. The vibrant red stood out starkly against the green and gold of the field, a macabre artwork that spoke of unspeakable violence. It was as if the scarecrows were sending a message, a warning to all who dared to enter their domain. They found Mary Sue Patterson in her own bed, her tiny body torn limb from limb. The bedroom, once a sanctuary of childhood dreams, had become a scene of unimaginable horror. The walls, once adorned with cheerful drawings, were now splattered with blood, a testament to the brutality that had taken place. Her blood had been used to write a single chilling word on the wall, mine. The word, scrawled in a child's innocent handwriting, was a haunting declaration of possession. It was as if the scarecrows were claiming their victims, marking them as their own in a twisted ritual of blood and terror. The once peaceful town was now gripped by fear, its residents haunted by the knowledge that the scarecrows were no longer mere guardians of the fields, but harbingers of death. The screams began at nightfall, horrific soul-rending cries that echoed through the empty streets of Hollow Creek. Mothers clutched their children, their faces pale with terror. Fathers gripped shotguns, their knuckles white with fear. But there was nothing they could do. The scarecrows moved like phantoms through the night, their laughter, cold and hollow, echoing through the streets. The morning after the storm, the townsfolk emerged from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and terror. The whispers were gone, replaced by screams of anguish. The bodies of their children, mutilated beyond recognition, lay scattered throughout the town like fallen dolls. The harvest moon demon had come for their children, and it had left its mark. The townsfolk, fueled by rage and despair, rose up. They grabbed their pitchforks, their axes, their shotguns. They would have their revenge. They hunted the scarecrows down one by one, burning them in the streets, the air thick with the smell of burning straw and vengeance. But with each scarecrow they destroyed, a chilling truth settled in their hearts. The demon wasn't gone. It was merely biding its time, waiting for the next harvest moon, waiting for its chance to rise again. As the sun rose, casting long shadows over the charred remains of the scarecrows, a single crow cawed overhead. The harvest moon had set. The killing season was over, for now. But the townsfolk of Hollow Creek knew, deep in their bones, that the demon was still out there. Somewhere in the shadows it waited, and it would be back.